All right, so who here is a fan of the hit television show This Is Us? All right, some of you. Okay, it's usually I get nobody who respond to my questions when I ask about that kind of stuff. Regardless of whether you're a fan of the show, the smart ones in the room have made a sizable investment in the company that makes Kleenex brand face tissues since the day this show came out. But if you were really smart, and you saw where the trajectory of the show was going, you sold your stock, any stock you might have held in the creators of Crock-Pot before the season finale hit just this past week. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, This Is Us is a television show on NBC, which just completed its second season last week. The show is breaking huge records in terms of viewership and critical acclaim. It's winning award after award. It's become basically a cultural phenomenon at this point. Every week the show airs. The next day at least my office, and I'm assuming at many of your offices, talk is abuzz with chatter about how many tissues were decimated the night before. Aaron and I call the show our weekly cry. I'll just own up to it. I tried to man up and be like, no, it's no big deal. I can handle it. Like 2 episodes in, I'm like, all right, I'm just going to open it up and let the floodgates run. And I think, part of that is healing, because I think that's part of what makes this show so fantastic and so popular is that it's cathartic. There's something about it that just allows Americans to process their emotions, because there are a lot of emotions in our culture today, are there not? And they're usually not pleasant. But people are obsessed with This Is Us, and I think that's one of the very important reasons that people are obsessed with it. And I think it goes even beyond the great writing and the acting and the location. Speaking of location, for those of you who don't know, much of the show is based right here, not just in Pittsburgh, but in the South Hills of Pittsburgh. This Is Us follows the ups and downs of life for the Pearson family as the parents, Jack and Rebecca, raised their children in Bethel Park in the 1980s and 90s. It's based right here at Bethel Park. In fact, they use a Bethel Park address, and the creator, one of the creators, grew up in Bethel Park. So he said there's nothing more Americana to him than that environment in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So that's where he wanted to base his show. Now, of course, the children take off from there and they go all over the place, West Coast, East Coast, and all that. But if you're not familiar how the show works, it kind of time lapses back and forth between the early generation following the kids later on, and then we're seeing hints to the third season. There's going to be a third generation we start to see. So you start seeing these time jumps, but the first generation is all based here in Bethel Park. And it's kind of cool, seeing them waving their terrible towels and, doing all the 70s Steelers stuff as part of as their relationship develops. But their family life, just like all of our lives, is filled with incredible highs and lows, awesome achievements and devastating tragedies, beautiful dreams that sometimes slip into enormous challenges. Their family begins with a beautiful marriage and an unexpected yet thrilling news that Jack and Rebecca are pregnant with triplets, the big three, as Jack calls them. Like any soon-to-be parents, their hearts are overwhelmed by the prospect of all the expectations and adventures that come with parenthood. They're a hard-working, selfless couple who do everything in their power to prepare for the coming of their 3 beautiful children. They put their dreams aside in order to provide for their kids. Rebecca puts her budding singing career on hold. She's played by Mandy Moore, for those of you who don't know, and part of the character development for her is that she's this beautiful has a beautiful singing voice. She's part of this band, and that's actually how Jack meets her. And then they get pregnant, and she realizes that it's just not going to work at the time for them, for her to pursue this and raise these 3 kids at one time, so she gives it up. Jack shelves his dream of owning his own business. He wants to be someone who owns his own home repair business, buying and selling homes, flipping homes, and the risk of that when having the prospect of having 3 young children is just too much for them, so he puts it on hold and takes a day job and just does what he has to do to earn a paycheck, take care of his family. They buy a humble home. They ready the bedrooms for their 3 beautiful children to come, all all until the wind is completely knocked out of their sails with an unexpected and devastating tragedy. Now, rather than me telling you the story about what happens, I want to show you a clip from the show. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long, so get comfortable.
Rebecca's vitals are good. She's going to be asleep for a little while, but she's doing fine, and we're monitoring her closely.
Okay.
We lost the third baby, Jack. I'm very sorry. The second baby is a girl, very strong. The third baby was a little boy, but the umbilical cord was cutting off his oxygen. He was stillborn. Nothing anybody could have done.
I'm sorry, I'm not processing anything. My wife
Is fine. And she'll be awake pretty soon. You have 2 beautiful, healthy children, Jack. Boy and a girl. But we did lose the third child.
I need to be with my wife.
And you will be. But she needs to sleep now. But soon. You just sit down. Sit. Okay if I keep you company a second?
Yeah.
Okay if I try and say something meaningful? I lost my wife last year, cancer. It's the reason I still work so much at my age. Just trying to pass the time. We were married 53 years. 5 children, 11 grandkids. But we lost our very first child during the delivery. The reason I went into this field, truth be told. I have spent 5 decades delivering babies, more babies than I can count. But there is not a single day that goes by that I don't think of the child I lost. And I'm an old man now. I like to think that because of the child that I lost, because of the path that he sent me on, that I have saved countless other babies. I like to think that maybe one day you'll be an old man like me, talking a younger man's ear off, explaining to him how you took the sourest lemon that life has to offer and turned it into something resembling lemonade. You can do that, then you will still be taking 3 babies home from this hospital. Just maybe not the way you planned. I don't know if that was meaningful or senile, but I thought it ought to be said. Your wife will still be asleep for a little while. Go see your babies. They're excited to meet their father. I think maybe they got a good one.
All right. So yeah, you probably weren't expecting you probably weren't expecting to need your box of tissues for Palm Sunday service, now were you? But today is Palm Sunday, and Today is the day the church around the world remembers Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, as Kevin already pointed out this morning. What does the tragic loss of a child have to do with Jesus' triumphal entry and the celebration of Palm Sunday? Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. So we're going to reflect on that for just a couple minutes. We're going to start by looking at this story together from John chapter 12. Check out how John tells the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. He says, news that Jesus was on the way to Jerusalem swept throughout the city. A large crowd of Passover visitors took palm branches and went down the road to meet him. They shouted, "Praise to God. Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hail to the King of Israel." Jesus found a donkey and rode on it, fulfilling the prophecy that said, "Don't be afraid, people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming riding on a donkey's colt." Many in the crowd had seen Jesus call Lazarus from the tomb, raising him from the dead, and they were telling others about it. That was the reason so many went out to meet him, because they had heard about this miraculous sign. Then the Pharisees said to each other, "There's nothing we can do. Look, everyone has gone after him." Yesterday it was reported that hundreds of thousands of people swarmed city centers around the nation in what was dubbed the March for Our Lives. Now, I'm not going to talk about the subject inspiring the march or the political fighting that has led to it. The only reason I mention it is because it's something to point out that we know what it looks like when throngs of people gather for a cause. Imagine the largest crowds that gathered in D.C. celebrating a man on a donkey riding up the steps of the Capitol building. And then you might start getting close to what Jesus' entry into Jerusalem must have been like. Tens of thousands of Jewish people gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. All of them were desperate for a leader to overthrow the Romans. All of them were likely talking about this guy named Jesus, murmuring amongst themselves, could he be the one? Could he be the one that the prophets had told us about centuries ago? Could he be the one who has been promised to us to be the new King David who would lead Israel for centuries, for eternity, make it a nation of mighty power forever and ever? All of them, as they watched Jesus come riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, instantly had their questions answered. They instantly recognized what Jesus was declaring. He was the one. Here came the king that they had been waiting for. Their Messiah, who had been promised for centuries, was finally here. Finally, someone would liberate them from their oppressors. They'd been waiting for so long. They'd suffered so greatly. They put up with their occupiers. They've resisted the worst of their demands. They've fought to maintain their identity. They've given up so much, clinging to the singular hope that one day the Messiah would come. And finally, he was here. The day had come. He was here. Finally, they would be free. Finally, they would have their own king in a kingdom that would have no end. These were the thoughts that were going through the minds of everyone in Jerusalem, including Jesus' own disciples. They all expected a political revolution. Just as we are hearing calls for change in our nation, in the streets of our nation, on the streets of Jerusalem, the crowds were chanting, "Hosanna in the highest, blessed who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna, praise to God, for here is the King of Israel." This is what they are calling out. They are calling for change and revolution. However, just a few days later, things changed dramatically. The wind was knocked out of their sails. When Jesus was arrested, it became apparent to the people that this wasn't the king they envisioned for themselves. He wasn't the kind of Messiah that they had in mind. The same crowds who waved the palm leaves celebrating the new King of Israel suddenly were demanding the conviction of the one who was the greatest letdown in their lifetime. The same mob who welcomed Jesus like a celebrity now jeered him as a criminal deserving death. If we've learned anything during the most recent tumultuous political season, the season that we're still living in today, it's that people, especially when they're bunched together in crowds, can dramatically escalate in a matter of seconds. In a matter of seconds, a peaceful protest can turn into a frightening mob, and we see this playing out during Holy Week. It's exactly what's playing out. We're living in tumultuous times, but it's still nothing compared to what the disciples experienced during this week. Within a week, the crowds went from loving Jesus to demanding Jesus' death. Within a week, the disciples went from being close friends of the most popular man in all of Israel to being convicts in hiding. Everything had fallen apart as far as the disciples were concerned. This wasn't what they had envisioned for themselves. This wasn't part of the plan that they had for their lives going forward. They've been dealt a significant blow. They're scattered. They're hiding. They're frightened for their lives. We all know how Peter responded to the tragedy. He flat out denied even knowing Jesus. And perhaps now we can understand a little bit more why Thomas wasn't so quick to accept the news when he was told that Jesus was back. Not only had Thomas endured all that the disciples had endured with Jesus' execution, but he is the only disciple who missed Jesus' first resurrection appearance. I mean, listen to how John describes this scene later on in John chapter 20. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side, and they were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus appeared to them. They told him, "We've seen the Lord," but he replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands and put my fingers into them and place my hand into the wound in his side." Now, I've always related to Thomas, and it's not simply because I share his name. I think most of us can relate to Thomas. Have you ever been the guy or the girl left out? Have you ever been the only one who missed out on an experience when something big happens? Have you ever been in Thomas's shoes? Have you ever been the one who misses something enormous? There's no telling what Thomas was doing. I mean, why was he the only one not in the room that night? Maybe he was out for a walk. Perhaps he was out gathering intel on whether or not the Jewish leaders were hunting them down. Maybe he ran out to the store to pick up some bread and milk before the predicted early spring snowstorm. Maybe he was binge watching This Is Us. We don't know what he was doing. But he wasn't there. He was the only disciple missing when Jesus returned. And understandably, after all he's been through, he wanted to see proof. I mean, wouldn't you? If I came to you and told you someone just walked out of the grave, you'd want proof. I told you I saw Bigfoot once, and you're like, what? Come on. At least that's believable. Just now, laugh. That's In his mind, there's no way anything positive could be coming out of their circumstances. In his mind, everything was ruined by the tragedy of Jesus' death. In his mind, there was nothing but pain and sorrow and grief in his future. And John continues the story, picking up in verse 26. He says, 8 days later, take note of that, 8 days, the disciples were together again. And this time, Thomas was with them. He wasn't leaving. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed. Then Jesus told him, "You believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." I don't know how many of you have ever noticed that Jesus took 8 days to reveal himself to Thomas, to appear before Thomas. That's more than a week. That's a long time. Who knows what must have been going through the mind of Thomas? We know he doubted the physical resurrection enough to demand physical evidence. We know that. That's why we oftentimes give him the name Doubting Thomas, because of that doubt. But I'm convinced Thomas demands physical evidence because he demands physical evidence because if their claim was true, that would be even more challenging of a reality to believe and to process than if it wasn't. I mean, if Jesus really walked out of the grave, if he truly revealed himself to the other disciples, leaving Thomas on his own to hear the story secondhand, what does that say about Thomas? If Thomas didn't doubt the resurrection, he surely began to doubt himself and God's love for him. Have you ever been there? I have. Jesus showed himself, appeared before the other disciples on the day of his resurrection, but for 8 long days, Thomas was left with nothing. What was that all about? Was Thomas not faithful enough? Was Thomas not committed enough? Was Thomas not good enough? Why didn't he just come back? What was so important that Jesus couldn't manifest himself for just a few minutes later? Why was this happening to Thomas? Insidious doubts had to have been raging through Thomas's heart throughout this time. It's no wonder we remember him for more than his doubt. It's no wonder we remember him more for his doubt than for his willingness to die for Jesus. Do you remember he's the only disciple who immediately says, "I would die for you, Lord." But I'm not convinced the doubt was solely over whether or not Jesus walked out of the grave. I believe the identity of doubting Thomas at least partially stems from that 8-day period when Thomas was simply left to wonder, why me? Why me? And I don't know about you, but that's the Thomas that I relate to kind of at my core. Thomas did everything right. Thomas followed Jesus. He declared his faith. He even publicly stated his willingness to lay down his life for him. Yet he gets the short end of the stick. He's the only one dealt this crappy hand. Rebecca and Jack Pearson in the clip spent 9 months preparing to welcome their triplets. They walked away from some of their biggest dreams. They renovated a small house just enough to fit them all comfortably. They did everything right. Surely when they heard the news that they lost one of their 3 children before they were ever even able to meet him, some of the same questions would have been going through their minds, the same questions that went through the minds of the Jewish people some 2,000 years prior. And surely some of the same thoughts that went through the minds of the disciple, and specifically disciple Thomas. Why did God let this happen to them? Why did God allow this to happen? They did everything right. Why were they being punished? It's a bitter pill to swallow. I love what the doctor says in the clip that we watched earlier. He says, if you can take some of the sourest lemons life has to offer and turn them into something resembling lemonade, you'll still be taking 3 babies home from this hospital, just maybe not the way you had planned. What we are fortunate to know as people who watch the show, which the characters obviously aren't privy to because they're characters in a fictional world, Rebecca and Jack would in fact take 3 babies home from the hospital that night, well, after their hospital stay. Lying right next to the 2 children who did survive delivery, Jack and Rebecca would find a young black baby who was mysteriously abandoned at a fire station earlier that night. The little boy has no family. The little boy was completely on his own. Taking that as a sign that this little boy was meant for them, the Pearsons decided to adopt the boy, whom they would eventually name Randall. Here's the family photo of the new Big 3. To me, this is the constant lesson I find when I reflect on the story of Palm Sunday. Life is not going to go as you and I have planned it to. Life is going to hand us some pretty sour lemons, some pretty bitter lemons from time to time. But we have a choice in how we respond to those lemons. The people of Jerusalem fully expected Jesus to be crowned king. And as soon as it was clear to them that he wasn't the sort of Messiah that they expected, they lost all hope and they became absorbed in their rage, calling for Jesus' murder. That's how they responded to the lemons of Jesus not being the Messiah they expected. They got angry. And they became engrossed in their rage. The disciple Thomas was left to wonder, why me? The rest of the disciples claimed that Jesus walked out of the tomb. They claimed to not only see him, but to interact with him. Thomas will forever be known for his doubt. And I'm convinced much of that doubt was directed at himself. Self-pity. Being the only disciple not given a glimpse at the resurrected Lord, Thomas surely doubted God's love for him and his own self-worth. That's how Thomas responded to the sourest lemons that he had to deal with. He doubted. He became engrossed in that doubt, so much so he became known as Doubting Thomas. Jack and Rebecca, on the other hand, they decided to turn some sour lemons into something resembling lemonade. And they endured the loss of a child, but recognized a child in need, opening their home and their hearts to him. Now, I don't know what kind of lemons life is dealing you right now. Maybe you're grieving a loss. Maybe the job you had such high expectations for has turned sour. Maybe a long-time dream isn't panning out as you hoped it would. Maybe a relationship you never expected to cause you heartache just took an unexpected turn over some unexpectedly wicked rocks. Maybe it's something else entirely. Whatever the lemons in your life are today, the message of Palm Sunday couldn't be clearer. The message of Palm Sunday is you can choose how you respond to those lemons. You can be overwhelmed by anger, become engrossed in rage. You can succumb to fear and doubt, question God's love for you. Or you can choose to trust God and look to see where He's providing the sugar to make something resembling lemonade. You may not be in a place where you believe, or where you can even believe anything positive can come out of what life has dealt you. But I promise you, God can redeem even the worst circumstances, even your greatest fears, even the most tragic losses, for good, and ultimately for His glory. Let's close with a word of prayer.